In the fall of 1919, Thomas Laughlin was tired and worried. In all his years of selling cider in New Jersey, first in Newark, now here in Mendham, it had never been harder to turn a profit. 20 years ago, business was booming. The year 1904, in particular, had produced a bumper crop of the best apples New Jersey had ever seen. Not so great for the farmers who had to sell their apple crops at record low prices, but great for cider manufacturers like Laughlin. From the promise of those superior New Jersey apples, Laughlin was able to bottle and distribute quality hard cider and Applejack, the American name for apple brandy. 1904 was also the year Laughlin got an opportunity to expand his business, eventually moving his cider press from its original location in the center of town into the old Nesbitt grain mill 3 miles west on Mendham Road. It had been a calculated risk to convert a grain mill into a cider mill, but it paid off for over a decade. But then there was the 18th Amendment, ratified earlier that year in January 1919, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal. Prohibition would soon be in effect. But as Thomas Laughlin reflected on the events that brought his business to its knees, he undoubtedly wondered what the future looked like for his mill in Mendham. What would happen to this building that he had painstakingly converted, maintained, and operated? Would it even make it past the next decade, or would the wheels of his cider mill stop spinning for good? Welcome to Hometown History, a series about the iconic places and events that make a town someplace people call home. Stories that people can tell to their friends, old and new, about the place they live, did live, or will live. In my case, Mendham, New Jersey. And today we talk about how one of the icons of that town, a cider mill, evolved with the times through legislation meant to dry up all the fun. Fall harvest is a very special time for Mendham. It's like the area's Super Bowl. Porches explode with pumpkins, leaves on the trees of Jockey Hollow sparkle golden in the sunlight, and tourists flock from all over for apples. You can pick them, bob for them, eat them candied or caramelized, but in this town, you can also press them. Every year in October, the Ralston Cider Mill in Mendham Township holds a pressing event. One might even call it a press conference. Located on the south side of Route 24 between Mendham and Chester, the Ralston Cider Mill stands like a large but unassuming sentinel. Its worn wooden stairs and slightly ill-fitting door suggest that this place is original to the era in which it was built.
So underneath this wooden piece, you see there's a big vertical rod there. That's called the main shaft. That went from a turbine.
James Malchow, the director of the Ralston Cider Mill Museum in Mendham, gave my producer Katie and me a tour of the inside of the cider mill earlier this spring.
Great big belts.
Now, the first thing you need to know is this place didn't always used to be a cider mill. Instead of crushing apples, this mill once used water power to crush grain. In 1848, John Ralston Nesbitt, grandson of the first Ralston to settle here, borrowed money from his mother to build a house and a grain mill on this site. And I say that because nearly every history book mentions this strange fact. Poor guy will forever be known for borrowing money from his mom. But hey, it was a good investment because this 175-year-old mill has withstood a retrofit, 2 gruesome deaths, prohibition, 2 world wars, and a family of raccoons. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
In any case, when you start up the equipment, which I can do if you like, stand by that wheel.
Okay. Oh.
Turn that wheel about
This one?
Yeah, about.
James has me reach down, turn the wheel 180 degrees, which starts the apple pressing process. The various belts and wheels, once powered by water from nearby Burnett Brook, kick into gear. Today, everything works with electrical power. As we walk around the mill, James points out the belts and wheels turning slowly but surely to move a giant apple press down.
Everything runs off of here. The apples come into the building from outside on that conveyor. which is controlled off this shaft. The grater that turns the apples from whole fruit into a mush called pomace is controlled off here. And then when the apples and that pomace are made, they come in down from one floor to the other. Now they're under just the power of gravity. And
I didn't realize until I was doing research for this episode, but New Jersey is, historically, one of the biggest apple producers in the U.S. Sorry, New York. I'm just the messenger. Apples are as American as apple pie, even if they are from Kazakhstan. But they made their way to North America and were planted in the soils across the eastern seaboard, thanks to people like John Chapman, literally Johnny Appleseed, who realized that land was made more valuable by the presence of fruit-bearing trees, or vines. New Jersey's success with apple growing dates back to the early 1700s. In fact, one of the towns where apples flourished was an eastern section of early Newark, which now goes by the name of South Orange. The oranges were originally named for King William of Orange. So the town's name and the fruit were two totally different things. Apples and oranges. Now, you can make a lot of things with apples. Apple pie, applesauce, apple strudel, maybe if you're German. But the number one thing that American colonists made with apples was alcohol. Hard apple cider and apple brandy were produced and consumed in almost every community where the fruit was grown. These beverages were more popular than wine, beer, whiskey, even more popular than water, which colonists were actually afraid to drink because it carried disease. So cider was the drink of choice in colonial America, and cider made from Newark apples was known as some of the best in the New World, even favored by the likes of Thomas Jefferson. Apple historian and food writer Fran McManus says that it has something to do with the growing conditions here.
So it was the soil was considered to be the reason that the apples were so good from there, but the trees were described as kind of gnarly and the apples were it wasn't like lush. It was almost as though they had to work hard in order to achieve that level of flavor.
In 1817, Newark cider was selling for $10 a barrel, while other cider makers weren't even clearing $2 a barrel. In 1828, one Connecticut farmer complained in the American Sentinel that Newark cider was selling for 4 to 5 times that of New England cider. He went on to say that it was wrong to have the Yankees so much outdone. Why was Newark cider the best in the land? Because not all apples are created equal.
They didn't need to match our expectations of eating apples, right? The good cider apples can be very bitter. They can be very tannic. Those are qualities you want in a hard cider.
There are apples for eating and apples for drinking, and some even more appropriate for distilling.
And then the other thing was that cider makers in Newark had a reputation for the quality of the work that they did. They chose apples very specifically for the cider. They produced a high quality product because they were craftsmen in a way.
And one of those craftsmen was named Thomas J. Laughlin. Thomas Laughlin was a liquor distributor and cigar salesman from Newark. He had a shop on Market Street, but notably enjoyed spending time in the country. People's thirst for Applejack had grown dramatically throughout the 1800s, so Laughlin, a shrewd businessman, decided to expand his business by making the liquor that he was distributing. And in 1899, he moved his business to a rural outpost of Newark that he was fond of visiting, Mendham, New Jersey, where he was in good company. 200 years ago, on Sunday mornings in Mendham, the pews of Hilltop Church were full of devoted worshipers, who also happened to own distilleries. Mendhamites loved their alcohol, so much so that when Reverend Philip Cordlet Hay vigorously attacked members of the church who manufactured liquor, he was, quickly dismissed. By 1830, Morris County had 53 working brandy stills, second only to Hunterdon County. In 1850, a quarter of Mendham's farms reported income from apples. One of those farms was run by the Thompsons, who owned a distillery on Hilltop Road. Like a lot of folks at the time, the Thompsons made cider from the apples that they grew. The resulting cider or applejack could then be sold locally or even traded for other products from the small town's barter economy. Who needs gold when you have applejack? By the end of the 1800s, the economics of cider making had shifted away from distilling at home in favor of larger cider making operations that would serve the entire community. By 1899, the Thompsons had not run their cider mill for some years. And this presented Laughlin with the opportunity he was looking for. He started leasing the distillery at the Thompson farm. Savvy as ever, Laughlin took out a patent on his product, Tiger Applejack, in 1901, just as demand for the beverage was peaking. By 1904, New Jersey was on track to produce an estimated 1 million gallons of the spirit. But it must have been hard to run a fledgling business off the Thompson family estate. Laughlin would have been on the lookout for a more permanent home for his cider-making operation. And then, a piece of property became available. Not just any property, an old grain mill just 3 miles west down Mendham Road. Old Mama's boy Nesbitt, just kidding, was in his late 80s at the turn of the century. He had been running his grain mill for close to 50 years, until one day, when he was on the 3rd floor of the mill, he keeled over from a heart attack. Seizing the opportunity, Laughlin purchased the grain mill and retrofitted it into a cider mill. By 1910, Laughlin had his cider mill up and running, producing thousands of gallons of apple cider and then applejack. At its peak, Laughlin's cider mill was pressing apples with a yield of 4 times that of the Thompson distillery. But time was running out for Thomas Laughlin and his successful cider-making business. Prohibition was on the horizon. The Anti-Saloon League was pushing the 18th Amendment through Congress, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. By January of 1920, Prohibition was in full swing. This effectively put an end to Thomas Laughlin's cider business. Laughlin himself died just a few months later. But it was not the end of the cider mill. By the early 1920s, the Ralston cider mill was under new management, a family of French bootleggers by the name of the Dubuques. And it was retrofitted again to be useful in the underground economy.
The garage from the outside, if you imagine there was a building there.
Outside the mill, James points over to where an unassuming garage once stood on the property. It was the key to the cider mill's successful bootlegging operations throughout the 1920s.
You would never know that there was actually a foundation and a basement underneath it. The basement down there was for bottling liquor, but you wanted to keep it hidden. So it was accessed through a trap door in the middle of the floor, or if you needed to load up a car, you could park it to the side of the trap door and carry things up the steps and load it up. But basically you could drive an empty truck into the garage, load it up with alcohol and pull it out again, and nobody would be able to know that something funny was going on because everybody was downstairs in the basement that was hidden doing the bottling.
So to the casual observer, the cider mill continued operating as a manufacturer of sweet cider, a beverage that was still popular since, if you left it out for long enough, it would eventually ferment and turn into hard cider. But it was also secretly making applejack and transporting it to parts unknown via its sneaky car parked in the garage trick. In reality, it might not have been that big of a secret. Local lore suggests that nearly everyone in Mendham, including the police chief, knew what was going on at the cider mill and knew where to get some applejack if they ever needed it. Throughout the 1920s, the bootlegging Dubuques operated the mill until one day Mr. Dubuque was crushed to death by the mill's machinery. And honestly, I don't want to dwell on it too much because the details are really gruesome. Accounts of his death make the phrase bloody pulp sound like an understatement. So the mill was sold again, and this time to the Fornero family. Yes, Sammy Fornero of Sammy's Restaurant fame, a place that likely deserves its own episode. Even though the cider mill could legally produce applejack after 1933, lots had changed during the decade of Prohibition. Mendhamites still had a thirst for alcohol, though the deviousness of drinking illegally might have worn off. But their tastes had changed with the market. Applejack wasn't as in demand, and it was expensive to make.
Grain alcohol is cheap to manufacture. It's much more reliable in terms of planting a crop and so on. And the mill basically went out of business.
So the Forneros boarded up the cider mill, effectively creating a time capsule of cider operations from the turn of the century. And for decades, the only activity at the mill came from a bunch of raccoons that found it a nice place to raise a family. But a love of history, and apparently apples, runs deep in this town, and in 2000, some local preservationists got to work saving the mill.
And they created a nonprofit museum to focus on restoring it. The town and the state both had open space money that went towards buying the property and preserving it. And so there is no end to the story.
And the mill will press on. So, while Thomas Laughlin's cider business technically didn't make it through the present, the building that housed the operation and the story of that business remains, just as the machines that do the pressing are still operable. In fact, the Ralston Cider Mill is the only one that is operational with its original historic equipment, a piece of history that feels right at home here in Mendham. This episode was written and produced by Ryan Ross and Katie Feather. It was mixed and edited by Katie Feather. Our theme music is La Danse Timide by Howard Harper Barnes. Special thanks to James Malchow, Fran McManus, Megan Muehlbauer, and the New Jersey Folk Festival. Additional information provided by the Morristown Library History and Genealogy Center. For more information, visit our website, hometownhistorynj.com.